ข่าวจากสำนักข่าวอินดิเพนเดนต์วันพุธที่ 12 กันยายน 2018 วุฒิสมาชิกสหรัฐกล่าวหาอังกฤษวางแผนที่จะใช้อาวุธเคมีโจมตีประชาชนชาวซีเรียและป้ายความผิดให้กับรัฐบาลนายอัสซาดของซีเรียนายริชาร์ดแบ็กวุฒิสมาชิกแห่งรัฐเวอร์จิเนียได้ปรากฏตัวบนทีวีอาหรับและกล่าวหาอังกฤษว่าหน่วยข่าว Mi6 หน่วยข่าวกรองของอังกฤษวางแผนที่จะใช้อาวุธเคมีโจมตีประชาชนซีเรียและป้ายความผิดดังกล่าวให้กับนายอัสซาดผู้นำรัฐบาลซีเรียโดย Mi6 วางแผนจะใช้กลุ่มกบฏในการดำเนินการดังกล่าวกระทรวงการต่างประเทศสหรัฐอเมริกาได้ออกมาปฏิเสธข้อกล่าวหาของวุฒิสมาชิกแบล็ก
Between the last week of April and the first 2 weeks of May of 2016, Janice Kortkamp Fearing and Senator Richard Black, state senator from Virginia, spent time in Syria. Senator Black spent a week at the end of April, and several days after he left Syria, Janice arrived, and both had the opportunity to tour parts of the country to interact with the Syrian people. Senator Black was invited by the Syrian government, had the opportunity to meet with President Assad and many other leaders. He traveled to Homs, to Palmyra, was in Damascus, briefly was in Beirut on his way in. And Janice was really much more there on a people-to-people visit. She made a lot of friends through Facebook and had the opportunity not only to tour around, but to stay in homes of people that she had gotten to know in advance. Between the two of them, they've developed an extraordinary understanding of the real situation on the ground in Syria. It's a profoundly human picture that they can convey, and it's something that has been missing completely from even the most honest attempted coverage of the 5-year Syrian tragedy. So we want to take this opportunity for Janice and Senator Black to give us a living human picture of what's actually happening in Syria. What are the consequences of this 5-year effort at regime change, which sadly our own United States government has been a central player in promoting. And so there is blood on the hands of American officials. And I think that you're going to get a unique view of what has actually happened and the tremendous courage and moral fabric of the people of Syria, of all religions, of all denominations. So with that as just a brief introduction, Senator Black, why don't you start and give us the walking tour, if you will.
Okay, well, let me start by saying here we are past the 5th year of war. We're going into the 6th year of war. And at this point, this is a country of 23 million people. After all of the world's powers, NATO, EU, the US, Britain, France, all of the dictatorships of the Arab world, Saudi Arabia, really vicious countries like that, Turkey, all of them descending on a small country of 23 million people, and yet the people of Syria remain united. They remain totally, so incredibly supportive of their government. And you think of the Second World War. Adolf Hitler probably had 6 to 8 attempts on his life, serious, some of them very serious. not one attempt on President Assad's life during this time. The people, the government controls 75 to 80% of the population, and Jan got a very good feeling for what their reaction is and their level of support. And Jan, maybe you could comment on that.
I'd love to. I traveled through Damascus, of course, into Latakia and Homs and the countryside around those areas. I met with many people from a broad spectrum of the population, and I can tell you that every single person I met, when they found out that I had an understanding, as you mentioned in the introduction, of our government's role in this regime change coup, that they all just almost took me by the shoulders and said, please, please go back to America and tell the people there the truth. And I just have this feeling in my heart that if America could see the reality of Syria, of what they are as a culture, who they are as a society, we would be naturally drawn to these people. They're wonderful, gracious people, and they simply want to have their side of the story told, as you said.
Yeah, and of course, Americans know very little about Syria. They hear a few taglines about, dictators and gas and all of this stuff. It always strikes me as incredible when I hear dictator Bashar al-Assad. He was popularly elected in 2014 in an election that was fair and open. He won 79% of the vote, and 3/4 of the electorate turned out. And he was not only overwhelmingly elected and re-elected in Syria, but also in other countries like Lebanon, where Syria has no effective control. What is interesting, I have studied what's going on ever since we invaded Libya, because I was very curious. Why are we attacking a neutral, non-belligerent country, which is a strong ally of ours, thriving, top per capita income in all of North Africa? And that led me to the eventual discovery that we were invading them to capture their weapons and send them into Syria ultimately to destabilize the government. And so I began studying. One of the first things that you do in open source intelligence is you study the players. You look at the players. And so I studied videos of President Assad and of the First Lady, Asma Assad. And they're never shown on television because they don't fit the mold of,
Right.
you don't have these tyrants, and you don't have the arrogant First Lady who's pompous and wearing all this jewelry and stuff. Instead, you have two people. President Assad, I spent 2 hours with President Assad, and he sat there. He is a superb listener, and he's a very soft-spoken man, very much a gentleman in all respects. There's nothing Mr. Macho about him. He's just, although he's very courageous to take this on and to be steadfast through all these years of war, where I'm sure the United States conveyed the word, if you're going to stay, you're going to die. Mm-hmm. And he had to talk with his wife and his children and say, if we leave, these people are going to be slaughtered, and we're not going to leave. And that means we are going to be prepared for the ultimate end. Mm-hmm. Well, his wife, Asma Assad, is really intriguing because she was born and raised in London of Syrian parents. Her father was a cardiologist. She was a brilliant student, and she actually worked for a large banking firm, and she was doing corporate acquisitions and things of that sort. She was preparing, she had her whole career laid out. She was going to go to Harvard and take an MBA. and she met Bashar. And they're both young people, and they fell in love. And she could not let anybody know because she's dating the future president of the country. And so when they finally decided to tie the knot, she went to Syria, and for several months she went incognito, and she just worked as an ordinary employee, and she worked in government agencies, she worked in businesses, all of these things so that she could savor the feel for what was going on. She's a person of supremely high IQ, but as I sat there with them, I noticed her dress. She was dressed very modestly. She's a very lovely woman, very stylish in terms of, she looks like an American housewife. And very sort of vivacious, joyous. She had a wonderful spirit about her. And when she speaks, the president listens. He's very courteous. He's very gentlemanly with his wife. And later I looked at some of the photographs, and he's sitting there, and his hands are folded as he's listening to his wife, and she's gesturing very, very effectively. Well, it was very eye-opening because he, the things that he told me were things that just simply confirmed all of the studies that I've done for 6 years almost on Syria. And I found out that before the war started, he never intended to be the president of Syria. And his brother, who was the heir apparent, was killed in an accident. And so he was called back and prepared for the presidency. I honestly think that there probably are many times where he thinks, I wish I could be back practicing ophthalmology, right, and we could just be enjoying the children. Because when they came to Damascus, they got an apartment out in town, and they had ordinary neighbors living around them. They just lived with the people, not in some grand palace, but just in an ordinary apartment. And President Assad would drive his own car, and they didn't take security with them. They just take off and they go wherever they wanted. Just the opposite of what we see here. We have the imperial presidency where the president goes and he has a convoy of 20 vehicles and they stop all of the traffic. Right. And you expect the typical American first lady is pompous and arrogant, and she surrounds herself with all the trappings of court. Yeah. But over there, simplicity and a feeling of we want to be a part of the people. We don't want to be above the people. We want to be part of the people.
I was in Syria and then in Egypt in March and April of 2010. So in other words, the year before all of the destabilizations began. And walked the streets of Damascus. I didn't get out to the countryside, but I came away with the idea that this is a very modern, very well-run country. Damascus was the cleanest city my wife and I had ever seen in our lives. And we walked through the big open market with the copper roof, and we went into the Grand Mosque where the tomb of John the Baptist is inside the mosque. And we just had an extraordinary experience, and it felt like living and walking around New York City or Paris or one of the great cities of the world, with the added dimension of this extraordinary history there. And from Damascus, we flew to Cairo and spent several weeks in Egypt. And we came back to the States, and I basically said, Syria is a very stable, very well-run country, and Egypt is about to blow up. people didn't want to hear it, but I said, you know, the wealth gap, the anger at the leadership, which really was, you know, becoming more and more of a kind of corrupt dictatorship. All of the ingredients were there for Egypt to blow up. But there was nothing, none of the things that you would have seen as an internal problem in Syria, which is why from the very outset, it was clear as day that this was an external regime change operation. And as you've said, you've looked at the whole events leading up to it, the history of long-time statements of intent, planning for regime change. And there was nothing spontaneous, nothing internal about this whatsoever. And
No,
it's striking.
As you mentioned that, I ran into several people, just random people, who actually had been demonstrators. And they often talk about, oh, this, you know, demonstrations turned into revolution. And I spoke with one fellow on the last day, and just at random, you know, we were talking about different things. He said, I was a demonstrator against the government. I said, tell me about that. He said, well, my uncle organized this city, and he was organizing demonstrations. And what Americans need to realize is that demonstrations over there, the initial demonstrations, are like demonstrations in the United States, where you have, you know, you have pro-life, you have pro-abortion, you have pro-gun, you have anti-gun. These people, you know, they go out to the streets and they've got signs and things, but they're not trying to bring down the government. They're trying to bring about a specific change, and this is what it was. Well, so this fellow told me, and similar, all three of them. He said we started off. He said it was just a regular demonstration for change, and he said in short order, he said Al Qaeda flags showed up. Now remember, Al Qaeda. These are the people that brought down the Twin Towers in the Pentagon.
That's right.
So Al Qaeda flags, and they said we don't want these. Get rid of them, But they kept bringing them, and the next thing, there were military-style weapons. And I'll tell you, in Syria, you don't just go to the corner drugstore and buy military-style weapons.
Right.
They don't have a Second Amendment like we do. And so they were coming in from Turkey. And they kept trying to get rid of this. We don't want this. And then the final thing is they began to proselytize religious hatred and religious divisions. And he said his uncle struggled against this because he was trying to keep it a genuine demonstration. He said in the 7th month, Al Qaeda murdered his uncle. And so I asked him, I said, what was the period of time between when you had genuine demonstrations and when it turned into Al Qaeda, generated violence? He says about a month. Now that stunned me because I knew about the transition, but I had two of them who said a month, and one of them said about 2 months. So, but it was a brief time.
Yeah.
And you could see, obviously it was orchestrated by intelligence agencies from foreign nations to make that happen. And the Muslim Brotherhood, of course, is always a tool that they can use to generate hatreds.
Right. I should just add one thing that I think is relevant as you look at the U.S. policy side of this, which is that in August of 2010, President Obama signed Presidential Study Directive 11, which commissioned a study of how the U.S. should orient towards political Islam, was the term that they used, and anticipating instability in the Middle East and Africa. And in February of 2011, he signed an executive order, which was Presidential Decision Directive 13. And it basically said, we're going to back the Muslim Brotherhood. That was the essential point. It's never been made public, and now, of course, they will do everything in their power to prevent it from being made public, but that was the thrust of it.
Well, we have a long history of this practice of weaponizing religion. And it started with Ronald Reagan, and I think even Jimmy Carter before him.
Right.
Jimmy Carter actually was probably the beginning of it. But we have really doubled down on it under the Obama administration. Much more so, I think, than the Bush administration. This idea that we will create religious hatreds. Where there are fault lines, we will push them into an earthquake. And with the idea, this arrogant idea that somehow you can open Pandora's box and you can unleash the horrors on whatever is your target, whether it's Libya, whether it's Syria, whether it's Iraq, and that it won't spread. And you look, just today, there's a big terrorist act taking place in Bangladesh right as we sit here.
Right.
Paris, Brussels, Boston, Fort Hood, San Bernardino,
Right.
all of it emanating not from Iran. Not a single one of these emanates from Iran. Not one.
Right.
I can't even name a terrorist event from Iran, but they stem from Wahhabism, which is the extraordinarily violent strain of Islam practiced by Saudi Arabia. And we have used that as a military tool to create violence, to invite violence against victim countries. And Syria has fought against this, and the United States, through $1 billion appropriations, continues to flood arms and supplies into Syria and to try to destabilize.
Right.
One of the things that you mentioned, Jeff, when you saw how healthy Syrian society was when you visited, and it's a nuance that a lot of people don't grasp, that the people there kept trying to show me, was that it's not about saving President Assad. It's not about a one-man kind of thing. Syria is like a three-chord strand or a three-strand cord, I should say. It's the president, the army, and the people. And the reason they're still standing is because all of those strands are strong.
Right.
And they're standing together. And they'll tell you, that they want to create a society, they want to create democratic structures, and they have many democratic structures. And President Assad does have that broad support of like 80% of the country. And they all are working together to defend their homeland. That's what they're defending.
Yes.
Represented by their leadership of President Assad and defended by their army.
Right.
But they are defending their homeland from this incursion of terrorists, criminals, and mercenaries supported by the West.
Right.
And that was a message that they were very passionate about sharing.
Along those lines, I went to Hamish Hospital in Damascus, and this is where they treat soldiers who have lost limbs in battle. So you have all of these amputees, and I'm not a very good follower, so typically people will say, okay, I'm going to show you this, and I said, well, let's go down this corridor. And I embarrassed myself a little bit by doing this in one case, because I went down, I said, let's see what's down here. And I went down, and these were guys who had recently been wounded and who had major loss of limbs. Typically, I think maybe all of them had lost legs. And I mean, not just the ankle, this I'm talking from the hip on down. And so I walked into one little, each had a little private, like a cubby, and I would walk in to shake hands with the soldiers, and the discipline of them, each one would struggle to sit up, and this is what sort of humbled me, because I would always say no. I don't want somebody who's just been suffered like this, but they are proud and they are strong. And over, you could just, from comment one after the other, they are so proud of what they have done. And
Right.
and I think of myself when I was wounded in Vietnam, I was surly. And you know, when they would come in, I'd be kind of grumpy, and you know, I was a very stoic guy. I was kind of extraordinarily stoic, and some of that. And I expected, you know, maybe there'd be a little bit of that, as some, you know, somebody kind of gritting his teeth. And,
Yeah.
But they were all very courteous, very polite, and very proud. I went to a place where they house refugees, because people don't realize most Syrian refugees are in Syria.
Right.
They're not in Turkey. They're not in Europe. They're in Syria, where they have been driven by the American-backed rebels. And I went into this one room, and they have very modest room, but you can see there some belongings are there. It's just one single room. And there was a man there, and he was seated. He's, you know, he may have been 60, 70 years old, I'm not sure. But he had a big broad bandage around his waist. And he apologized that he couldn't stand. I said, no. I said, don't. I was always embarrassed with these injured people wanting to stand out of politeness. And he told me that he had lost 12 of his nephews and sons in the war. And he was so proud that they had died for Syria. And then he explained, he said he had been badly shot up, and that's why he has to wear this binder to, you know, sort of strengthen his waist. And I encountered this repeatedly from soldiers wounded. And when I spoke with Asma Assad, she has got to be the finest first lady on earth. I can't imagine a better one. She said, you know, she said when the war started, she said, I would go and I'd visit the family that had lost sons killed in battle. And she said, I sort of girded myself for, you know, kind of bad reactions where, you know, people would be screaming and they'd be, you know, obviously distraught and just sort of letting out some steam at me. And she said I was prepared to just accept it. But she said now I've gone to over 1,000 homes. And she said, I have never encountered that. She said, over and over, she said, they just express, obviously, their tremendous sorrow at the loss of a son, or 2 sons, or 5 sons. But they're so proud that if they had to die, that they died for Syria.
Sure.
And you just, you know, it's just stunning, the level of patriotism. And it's like Jan says, you know, with the 3-strand cord, the people support their army. The army supports their president. The president supports the people and the army. They are all interwoven. And to this day, and you'll hear this from many people, that President Assad and his wife will just decide they're going to go somewhere, and they go in Damascus without security, which is a little bit stunning to me. They don't have Secret Service. Now, they don't do it announced, because
Right.
if they were announced, they'd be bumped off by the CIA or MI6 or Mossad or any one of about a dozen different organizations, some rebel and some NATO. And so they just jump in the car and off they'll drive. They went to Christmas Mass.
Yes.
They joined the Christmas, the Christians for Christmas Mass. Just dropped in. Because they know that as long as they're with the Syrian people, they're safe.
Right.
Because the Syrian people love them. They absolutely adore these people. They have a connection that's at a friendship level. It's not at a, looking down their noses level like we're so accustomed to in this country.
Right. And when you say the people, you both told me that it's a very ecumenical situation. You had the experience when you were in Homs of going to that theater, and you've got some pictures of that. I think that's pretty much of an extraordinary snapshot of in the middle of this war.
This is something that is culturally unique. I don't know that it exists in any other country.
I agree.
And it's you have a variety of religions. You have Sunnis, you have Shiites, Alawites, Christians. You have the Druze. You have the Kurds, who have a various type of Sunni Islam, but a whole variety of things. And I'm leaving out others. And they have managed to weave together in harmony. And somebody said, so it's sort of religious tolerance. And I said, it's not the word, because tolerance implies it's something that you dislike, that you put up with, you tolerate it. Mm-hmm. I said, it's much more beautiful than that. It's like a religious tapestry, and it's not that the Christians do not practice Christianity, or the Shiites practice the Shiite faith, or the Sunni, but it is sort of, it's a close friendship, and it's a loving friendship among people. And so I was in the city of Homs, which is a major city in Syria. And the governor of Homs province, the largest province in Syria, he and his wife, they're Sunnis, and they took me out in the evening and they said, would you like to go to a choral presentation? I said, sure, let's go. So we went, and this is a large theater. It'd be a fairly decent sized theater in the United States. And it's filled up with, I don't know what, there may have been 1,000 people in there, 800,000. And so everybody is seated there, and things are sort of underway, and the mayor walks in. Well, the mayor of Homs, and also the governor of Homs province, he's one and the same. And he says, would you like to speak to people? I said, well, I hate to interrupt, but I would love to, do that. So he briefly interrupted, and I first apologized for interrupting, and then I said, look, I just want to let you know that there are people in the United States who are beginning to understand what's going on here and who want peace. And I said, I am one of them, and I just admire you so deeply. Well, anyway, so I sat down, and everybody was very polite. I got a nice little round of applause, and so I sat down, and the lights went down, and I'm looking up at the stage, and there's a very charismatic, she's a blonde woman, so she kind of stood out in the light, and beautiful voice, and I'm listening in Arabic. I don't understand Arabic, and so gradually my eyes begin to drift, and I look over at the orchestra playing on both sides, and then I look back behind her at the choral group singing, and all of a sudden I'm stunned. Here is a theater screen, like a movie theater, and a gigantic image of Jesus Christ, crown of thorns, laboring under the weight of the cross on the way to Calvary. And so I leaned to the governor's wife, who's sitting next to me, and I said, is this a religious or a Christian theater? She says, oh no. She said, this is a public theater. She said, it's just, people who want to put on presentations do this here. I said, well, I'm just surprised, because only about 10% of Syria are Christians. And she said, many of the people in the audience are Muslims. She said, in fact, many of the choral group are Muslims. And then the next scene comes on the screen, and here's Jesus Christ hanging on the cross, obviously at the moment of crucifixion. And it was just stunning. And I ran into this time and again where people have the freedom of religion that I used to know when I was growing up as a boy. But it's been, freedom of religion is, it's rapidly dissipating in the United States. And you can practice religion in the walls of your church, but you better watch out if you get outside.
In the street, yeah.
I gave an interview at SANA, which is the Syrian National Network, and gave the TV interview, and then I'm out in the press pit, and I'm talking to the journalist. And all of a sudden I look at the wall, and here is a life-size cutout of a Christmas tree. And I said, what is this? And they walked me over, the reporters did. They said, oh, this is the martyr's Christmas tree. And they explained that a number of reporters for SANA have been martyred. They've been killed while they were reporting on the news at the battlefront. And their photographs and a little description are attached as ornaments on the Christmas tree, along with clearly Christian ornaments. Sure. I mean, they have Santa Claus, they have, they have the Christmas Grinch, but right. There's a star. There's a star at the top of the Christmas tree. So it's clearly Christian, and I thought 80% of these people are Muslims. It's likely that 80% of the people who are ornaments on the martyr's Christmas tree are Muslim. Mm-hmm. And everybody's fine with that because they know that it's a Christian expression of love for their Muslim neighbors. And I just thought, imagine if you did that at National Public Radio in the United States. Right. People would probably run over, they'd rip the Christmas tree to shreds. Right. The ACLU would file suit. People would be fired. In Syria, you have this spirit of religious harmony, and it worked beautifully until in 2006, WikiLeaks has released a document that in 2006, the U.S. Embassy laid out a detailed plan for how we were going to destabilize and topple Syria. And one of the things, the most sinister thing, is that we were going to weaponize religion and we were going to exploit religious fault lines to create divisions that would shatter the cohesion of the Syrian people. We're paying a price for it in Brussels, in Paris, in Bangladesh, in Boston, because you cannot weaponize religion and confine it to one target country.
This is something that's so important for the American people to understand, because as you were describing Syria, they'll call it a beautiful mosaic. It's all these different colors working together to create a beautiful picture. And the so-called revolution, this regime change coup, the desire is to take that beautiful mosaic and make it all one color, black. Yeah. So the culture is under attack. Women's rights are under attack. Women have basically equal rights there. Woman vice president, woman leader of parliament. The leading political advisor to President Assad is Dr. Shaban, a woman. Professors, scientists, teachers, you name it, jet pilots, naval captains, the women play this role. That's getting under attack. Right. The historical, cultural aspect is under attack. All of those fabulous, some of the greatest archaeological treasures in the world have been destroyed and looted. Every aspect of this amazing mosaic is under attack by this so-called revolution. And it's all going to be replaced with one thing, this one black color fundamentalist, extremist, political takfirism. And that is what is at stake here. And so the American people are confused. They think, oh, we're going to put in some nice democratic government and there are going to be elections and the people are going to decide. No, the Syrian people will tell you truly, there's no such thing as a moderate rebel. They have all vowed to establish an Islamic state. The only difference is who is the Khalifa of whatever ends up. So it's a clear black and white situation. It's a clear right and wrong situation. You either support civilization, which is to support Syria now, or you support barbarism, basically. And that's one of the key messages that they wanted me to deliver.
Yes, women receive equal pay. The women's rights movement over here would be quite envious. They receive equal pay. They attend universities with the men, and they take whatever topics whatever subjects they want. They dress the way that they want.
Yes.
They travel where they want. They marry whom they wish to marry. Their rights are equal under the Syrian constitution. Now, the Syrian constitution guarantees religious rights in 3 places, and it guarantees women's rights. And the Saudi Arabians are insistent that they change their constitution. Sure. Now, guess what? The Saudi Arabians don't have a constitution. Right. And their women have no rights whatsoever. Their women are property in Saudi Arabia. They cannot leave their residence without a man's permission and accompaniment. They cannot drive a car. They're prohibited from attending schools. And religious freedom, if you put up a martyr's Christmas tree, or if you put on a display of Jesus Christ risen on Easter, then you would literally lose your head.
Right.
That is punishable by death in Saudi Arabia. Why are we with Saudi Arabia? Why have we become allied with the most vile and barbarous and despicable cultures on earth, against the most advanced country in the Middle East, and frankly one from which we, the United States, could take some real cultural lessons?
Senator, you were in Palmyra, and I think this is something that really is one of the most extraordinary aspects of your visit, because of what had just happened in that city. It was just recently liberated, but had been occupied and controlled by ISIS for a period of some time.
Well, here's the thing. With Palmyra, we had this U.S.-led coalition, the coalition of all, I don't know how many, 20 countries or whatever, with all of their bombers and all of their military equipment. Palmyra is in the desert. It is not sand dunes desert, but shrub desert. Mm-hmm. And when ISIS attacked Palmyra, they did so with tanks, with artillery pieces, with trucks. There were probably thousands of vehicles coming across the desert to attack and seize Palmyra. Palmyra is a gem that really is a possession not only of Syria, but of all mankind, of all civilization. When Jesus Christ walked the earth, there were 2,000 years of civilization built one upon the other in Palmyra already. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, 2,000 years passed. There were beautiful temples and Roman columns. There still, thanks to the Syrian army, is a major fortress, a castle, the citadel up on the ridgeline. But we were so anxious to topple the Syrian government that somehow with all of our satellite technology and all of our night vision stuff and everything else, we were not able to detect 1,000 ISIS vehicles coming across the desert so that we could stop them and protect this UNESCO World Heritage Site that has been famous for hundreds and hundreds of years. And we deliberately allowed ISIS to seize Palmyra because it's on a direct course for Damascus. And we figured, hey, if they can topple the government, more power to them. Well, the government stopped them after they seized Palmyra, but they seized it, and it's the most fantastic place. Even today, you can tell after they have vandalized, after they have blown down columns, ancient columns that had stood there for thousands and thousands of years. They came in and they captured the chief archaeologist of Palmyra. He'd been there tending to these things for 40 years, and he was 82 years old, and they captured him. This man stayed there so that he could tell them, look, please, don't damage the history. Well, they want to damage history. They want to destroy every evidence, every trace of civilization. And so they came in and they tortured this man, the archaeologist, for a month. And they knew that he had concealed some of the most precious artifacts, and he knew the locations. And they tortured him, and he refused to break. And at the end of a month, they said, well, if you do not, we're going to behead you. And they took him out, and they took him in the square, and I stood in the square where he was, and they cut his head off. And then they hung his body from a Roman column. I had the great pleasure of meeting the son of the chief archaeologist, and they said, this is the son of the man who protected Palmyra and who gave his life. And I was sort of just in awe of the fact that I was touching the hand of this man. And it came to me, and I told him, of course, through an interpreter, I said, you know what? I said, 1,000 years from now, when people are coming to visit Palmyra from around the world, they're going to be told about your father and how he sacrificed his life to preserve what he could of this great heritage site. We could have prevented this if the coalition had been allowed, and I'm sure that our military people would have been more than happy to take out 1,000 ISIS vehicles in the wide open. They were told from the federal government, let them go. And but this heroic man, his body hung from the Roman columns because of our refusal to allow the military to strike. And so when I was there, the Syrian army, with the help of the Russians came in, and they took the war against terror seriously. And they went after Al-Qaeda. We complained terribly. Oh, you're not after ISIS. Instead, you're after Al-Qaeda, the group that killed 3,000 Americans on 9/11. We can't have that. You should be after the enemy that we choose. Well, once they got ISIS or Al-Qaeda under control, they went after ISIS. And so with their help, the Syrian army went in, and you know, I fought in the Marines in some of the most fierce combat in the Vietnam War. And I stood with the Syrian generals on the ridge line, absolutely barren of any protection whatsoever. And they showed me where they had attacked from 3 different directions. And at the top of the ridge, high up, was this castle, this citadel. And they had to seize the citadel in the wide open. And they showed me the deputy commanding general of all of their forces, and this was a great army, and he was killed personally leading the attack on the citadel. And I wonder today, with the deterioration in our military forces, how many of our top generals would personally be grinding it out and fighting his way leading the troops from the front. This is the courage and the valor of the Syrian troops. So then from there, I went out and I interacted with the military. We had a lot of security because we were about to enter Indian country.
Right.
And so I got to review some of the troops on the ridge line, the troops who had seized it. And it was the first time I've done a pass-in review since I retired with the old guard at Fort Myer back in '94. But I looked at those people and I thought, my gosh, I was wounded, my radio men killed beside me, and what I did was nothing. It was trivia compared to what you people have done, fighting year after year after year. And then we went and I said, look, I want to go over there. They've opened up a major airfield, and I went in one of the revetments, and the air crew came right out and met me. The two pilots were ready to hook on their parachutes and jump in the plane at a moment's notice. And so we shook hands, and the air crew came out, I climbed up on the MiG-23, great, huge plane. You got to have a ladder. You don't step up on the wing flaps of this plane. And they had actually been flying one of these jets as security while I was going around Palmyra. And when we left Palmyra, we had a truck with a dual-barreled heavy automatic cannon that was in the front. We were in a 4-ton bulletproof car. We had the jet swooping down on the right, and we had 4 assault helicopters close by on the left, and then a column of security troops behind us ready to get out into the assault if we had to. So I was inspired by that. I thought, we ought to just continue on to Deir al-Zor and try to relieve the siege there. But the army is so phenomenal. The things they have done. I mean, I've known a lot of fine troops, and I've fought with a lot of fine troops, and I can't think of any greater honor than to be around these people who have defended civilization against the barbarians for 5 years. And I'm so distraught that our country is on the side of the barbarians, trying to wipe and erase all evidence of civilization that decent men have preserved for 4,000 years.
This necklace was given to me by a Syrian soldier who's been in the conflict for the entire time. And I spoke with many soldiers when I was over there. And what really struck me were 2 things. One is, they will not stop. The Syrian army will continue to fight to the last man. And the other thing is how they are fighting for life. They're not these Takfiri terrorists that go in there because they want to kill as many people as they can and die. They're fighting for their families and their homes and their futures. They want to have a future. They want to live through this thing and have a future. And it's just such a dramatic contrast between the 2 groups and the spirit of those guys in the army.
Yeah. And I so admire Jan for what she did, because I was like part of a small army in some of the places I went, and Jan was just simply blending with the people, and she was near a place called Al-Zara, where American-backed rebels of Arar al-Sham committed a massacre very similar to the My Lai massacre, with the difference that at My Lai, the commander operated contrary to American policy, and at Al-Zara, Arar al-Sham acted consistent with the policy of his command. And
yes, I had stayed in a village in Homs countryside on the hills, and it was a beautiful little village. And people don't realize that in Syria you have big cities that, you know, have all the history and the modern, and then you have these wonderful villages that are scattered around, where every family has their own olive grove, and in harvest time all the family gathers and they harvest the olives. So I was up in this beautiful village, and I was out on the balcony of the house, and the person that I was with pointed out a village down below. He said it's about 2.5 kilometers away, and he said that's ISIS, an ISIS village. But it just so happens the topography wouldn't allow their mortars to get to the village that I was staying in.
Because it was on the higher ground.
Because it was on the higher ground. So the next day we drove from there to Homs City, and we're on this road, and my guide turned around and said, you know, now we're in the hot zone. Are you scared? And I can honestly say I was never frightened one moment when I was there. I don't, out of stupidity or whatever, but I wasn't.
well, I had the same thing. As long as you're with the Syrian people, and a lot of the people I was with were armed. But unlike now in Afghanistan, when you're with armed allied troops, you better watch your back, because they're going to kill you almost as quickly as the rebels. In Syria, you're
so
safe.
right.
If you're with the people, if you're among the people, then you're safe.
I never saw so many AK-47s in my life. So we're driving on this road, and my guide points out there's a power station right off the road. And beyond that is a little village. And you can just see it right there. It's within 1 kilometer. And we got to Homs, and it was the next day that Al-Zara got hit. And it's where the men had all their, you know, all the men had their throats cut, women and children taken captive, many women killed as well. And this is a group directly supported by the United States, publicly and openly supported by the U.S. as a moderate rebel group.
And we refuse to put them on the terrorist list, even though there's abundant evidence, because we have to be able to get arms and ammunition to Al-Qaeda, and so we need conduits, and so we keep open these conduits. They're every bit as vicious. In fact, they attacked this village in tandem with Al-Qaeda. They're all blended together, mixed together, and fortunately, I was able, you know, I got reports about it. I knew about the massacre because it was published. Now, it wasn't published in the mainstream media, but there were plenty of reports of it. And so I contacted Jan because of her contacts over there among the people, not the government, because I wanted to get firsthand accounts. And Jan was able to confirm that, you know, the number killed were 42. So she had exact numbers. The reports had been wildly, you know, all over the place. And also the fact that once they had killed the housewives, then they took the children and they hung them up and burned them alive. We support these people. We support people who hang children and burn them alive after the children have had to watch their mothers die and be slaughtered by these people. What's happened to us? What's happened to the, you know, I used to be, you know, I was in the Marines, and I started as a private, and we'd stand at attention at night. Every night we'd sing the Marine Corps hymn, and there's that line, we will fight for right and freedom and to keep our honor clean. We're proud to claim the title of United States Marine. Our honor is not clean. We have never done anything as a nation more loathsome and despicable than what we're doing in Syria. We have concocted all kinds of propaganda to smear them. And even though it's discredited, the media will not publish the actual facts. And we are helping the people who brought down the Twin Towers.
That's right.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, if this is not treason, then I don't know the definition of treason.
You know, the groups that you're talking about, Aish al-Shams, they're part of a larger form called the Army of Conquest, which is 100% backed by the Saudis.
Yes.
And so
Yes.
these groups are completely interfaced with Nusra, and because we refuse to accept the fact that they're no different than ISIS and Nusra, we complain when the Russians and the Syrians attack Nusra, and these people who are interchangeable parts are on the scene, and some of them are killed. So we're defending the indefensible, and if there was ever proof that the Saudis had a direct hand in sponsoring 9/11, just transpose that same relationship to what's going on in Syria right now. You know, the U.S. military would be happy to go after these terrorists as if they were indistinguishable from ISIS or Nusra, but it's rejected at the policy level back in Washington, even though, and the reason for that is because these are the Saudi-sponsored organizations, similar to what the Turks have been doing.
We're very much in the pocket of Saudi Arabia, which is almost uniquely the sponsor of global terrorism. Right. It doesn't quite capture it to say they're the number one sponsor, but they are the sponsor. Every terrorist event that pops up these days, it emanated either by direction from Saudi Arabia or through the Wahhabi practices, this violent Islam that's being pushed and financed all around the world. So it's quite a situation. You know, let me touch on one more thing with the religious freedom. I went and I visited the the Grand Mufti of Syria, and of course, he's the top Sunni, but he also he's a young guy. He's charming. I tell you, if you had a cocktail party, you'd want the Grand Mufti to be there. Just the most charming guy. And so we're talking, and he said, you know, he said in Syria, which has a population of 23 million, he said in Syria we are 23 million Christians. And he said my mother's name was Miriam, like Mary, the mother of Jesus. And so later, I was speaking with the patriarch, the Orthodox Christian patriarch of Syria and the East. And as we're talking, he said, you know, he said, we in Syria are 23 million Muslims. And when he said that, I said, you know, that's interesting because the Grand Mufti said just the reciprocal, and I explained it, and he said, he smiled, and he's a delightful fellow too, very, very charming. And he stroked his beard and he said, you know, he said, there are some who say that my beard is a Muslim beard. And so there is this sort of loving interaction between people that existed before we ever started mucking around with them. And we could, I'm not even sure, I say we could take lessons. I don't know that you can transpose this anywhere.
I don't think so. I think it's in the soil.
Yeah,
it really is.
It's sacred
Jen,
ground.
I wanted to ask you because you were really sort of out there, and I wanted to get your sense because in a certain way, you were really in direct contact, I assume, living as guests in people's homes and traveling around with a lot less security, but and the whole circumstance of your trip in the first place is fascinating to me. So maybe you could, I know that some of the pictures that you've got have to be sort of withheld because it's not a safe situation for people inside the country, people who you became close friends with. But give us a sense of how you got over there and what the, your correspondence on Facebook and when you got to meet the people themselves.
Well, it's been quite a process that started 4 years ago when I first saw an interview with President Assad. And it was about 2 minutes into that interview, and I thought, I was so intrigued. There's something here that I'm not getting, because up until then I supported all of this intervention and the war in Iraq and all these terrible, terrible things. But there was just something about his manner that just caught me, and the way that he explained things so carefully. And so I started researching Syria, and I got quickly obsessed with it. And he had said one thing in that interview with RT. He said, anybody can be president, but I'm a Syrian. I was born in Syria, and I'll die in Syria. And I thought, what is so special about Syria? That just struck me. And so I started researching the country as well. And then I realized that I could literally reach out to Syrian people going through this thing real time thanks to Facebook. And so I just started kind of putting out feelers there, and they were very anxious to tell their side of the story because the press here is so bad. 80% of the Syrian population, their voice is never heard over here, period. And so they were anxious to reach out to people. People here don't realize they all study English, and many of them speak it very well. And so it just started making these friendships. And that just blossomed and blossomed to the point of where I just felt I had to go. I had to go and just show I had to stand with my friends, and just go there and stand beside them and kind of co-suffer with them a little bit. And so I wanted to be like basically the first American tourist to go to Syria since the war began. Just kind of this person showing up at their doorstep and saying, I love your country, I want to come in, please. And it was proving difficult until Senator Black got in, and he was able to make a way for me to get the approval for the visa. And literally I kind of went in as a housewife going to Syria and just mucking around, as you said. It was an extraordinary honor and privilege to be granted that by the Syrian government. They not only allowed me in, but they just made a way for me. They gave me a lot of freedom and a lot of help just in the permissions that I needed, because you can't just travel from so to so. Right. You have to get all kinds of military permissions and government permissions to move around in the country. But I could talk to anybody I wanted. I could stay with anybody I wanted. It was just me and my friend and guide. And everywhere I went, every place, people love Americans there. They really just respond to us. And everywhere I went, they would say, you are most welcome in Syria. They hate our government with a passion. They hate our policies. They hate our interventionist arrogance, but they love the American people, and they were so gracious. One thing that we haven't touched on here are the economic sanctions. And I tell you, most of the good people leaving Syria are not leaving because they're afraid of violence. They're leaving because they see no future, because the economic situation is so dreary right now, and that's because of sanctions that the West has put on. It's literally a slow strangulation of a population, so they will get so miserable that they will finally rise up against this president that they've been supporting for 6 years. I think it's a crime against humanity, that policy.
It really is. And when I went to the hospital and I visited with the amputees, the director of the hospital told me that the sanctions prevent them from receiving prosthetic devices. And I spoke with he's a MiG pilot, a delightful guy, I mean, impressive. And He had lost a leg actually to a suicide bomber, and he was at a besieged airport, and for 41 days all he had was basic medical care. And finally the siege was broken and he was able to be operated on, but it took 2 years to get a prosthetic leg because of the United States sanctions. And the director of the hospital told me, he said, you know, we have a backlog of 600 cancer patients that are awaiting medication. Now, these are not military people, but just civilians. And the sanctions block us from receiving cancer medications that are only made in the West. Because, you know, we have very cunningly prevented them from transacting business and converting currency. So we are so intent on collapsing that government and imposing a barbaric Sharia law dictatorship under a puppet government that we will let people die of cancer and let people go without prosthetic limbs so that we can achieve our goals. This is the United States. This is what we believe in. I know the people of the United States would find this abhorrent, but the State Department / CIA, which are intertwined in one and the same, they make it so complex. They keep changing names, like ISIS. ISIS, one day they're ISIS, then they're ISIL, then they're Daesh, then the Islamic State. You know, and this doesn't just happen. This is done so that the whole war will be so opaque that people will not realize that we are committing war crimes of the highest order. These are war crimes where people literally should be executed for them.
Right.
But we do them, and we do them under cover of you know, various secret committees of Congress and secret things that go on in the State Department and the CIA. And it's a sign of why people are getting so fed up with their government. We do not trust the federal government because the federal government is doing things like this. It's supporting barbaric forces of terror against good, decent, moral people.
The reason that they have this alphabet soup of different groups with different names and groups that change their names every 45 minutes is because it's all used to prop up the big fraud, which is that there's a moderate rebel opposition. Now, I've talked to people who've been on the ground in this situation, and the fact of the matter is that Saudi Arabia, Turkey, the US, Britain, France, now Israel, are all providing the military equipment, the money, all of the kinds of things that fuel the insurgency. And the names are irrelevant because one day somebody's a member of the Nusra Front, the next day they're Aish al-Sham, the next day they're ISIS, because it's all determined by who's got the money and who's got the weapons on the ground. The names are absolutely meaningless, except insofar as it feeds the myth that somehow or other there's this magical moderate opposition, moderate rebel force that is going to really ultimately be the good guys that are installed in power. And it's a complete hoax. Nobody who's seen the situation on the ground remotely believes it, but it's to feed the propaganda. Literally, it's war propaganda that's stoking this. And the idea that the same people who lied about the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq are getting away with it again says something about the level of gullibility of our own people to not be asking more probative questions. And that's why I think it is so important that the firsthand experiences that you've both had gets out, and gets out to the American people, to the European people, because they're beginning to suspect that there's something really rotten going on here, and just simply showing what really is the situation on the ground. And I think that, you know, this is extraordinarily important, and a lot more of it has to be done.
You're exactly right. You know, there's this perception that they hate us for our freedoms. Nothing could be further from the truth. They hate us because we're bombing and killing and destroying their countries. And as I said, everyone I met just really expressed how much they love the American people. But there is also a true growing frustration, and in many people, an absolute hatred for us because we're not waking up.
Right.
We're not asking the most simple question, like, how is it possible to say that Saudi Arabia is helping to bring freedom and democracy to Syria? Why was not every journalist rolling on the floor in 2011 when those kinds of proclamations were coming out? People have to ask questions, and they have to seek out answers, because we, as you said, by our silence, we are supporting literally the devil's work in the Middle East. And
you think of it, here we are going into our 6th year of war against Syria, and not one single rebel leader has emerged as a popular figure with the Syrian people. Think about that.
Right.
Isn't that amazing?
just the opposite.
That nobody has said, oh yes, there's this great general, we love him, he's our savior, he's gonna, you know, take over our country and make us great, you know.
Right.
No, there's not one. Everybody loves the president of Syria. I mean, you know, I mean, he is really widely admired and widely loved by the people. And
they don't know anybody, because the regime change government that's been handpicked in Riyadh, in Ankara, in Washington, in London, they're living in 4-star, 5-star hotels in Istanbul and Ankara. And they're just, you know, lounging in the bars of these hotels, waiting for the word that they're going to be airlifted in. It reminds me of when Ahmad Chalabi was flown into Baghdad triumphantly after hundreds of thousands of American troops invaded the country for regime change. So,
well, it's reminiscent also of the Second World War, where Adolf Hitler, you know, there were a number of countries where he moved in, and there was a local group of sympathizers that could form a government, like Vichy France.
right.
But when he went into Norway, there was no Nazi infrastructure.
Yeah.
And so they struggled with it. And finally, they just simply installed through military force a man named Quisling.
Yes.
And Churchill seized on that, and he would rail about
Quislings.
the hated Quislings.
Right.
Adolf Hitler has imposed the hated Quislings on people.
Right.
Well, we're trying to impose a hated Quisling who will be despised by a sullen Syrian people who, you know, they may put up with him, because it's quite clear that the plan of all of these terrorist groups is that they will slaughter all of the Christians and all of the Alawites who are friends of the Christian. You're talking about 20% of the population of Syria, and this will happen, and it will happen if the United States succeeds in carrying out its goal of regime change. The Defense Intelligence Agency did a review, and they said they rendered 3 findings of fact. 1, President Assad must not leave office. If he does, the nation will collapse in chaos. And then they said it is a major problem that Turkey is supporting ISIS. And finally, their 3rd conclusion was there are no moderate rebels.
That's right.
And so this is what we face. You know, I look at the faces of children who gathered around me for photographs, and I look at the pictures and I think, you know, if we fail to stop this war, most of these children will be dead in the next 3 years, the children who sat with me.
One of the things that is important for people here to understand, because we're dealing with a lot of anti-Muslim rhetoric and this and that, and it's a Sunni versus Shiite war. But the Syrian army, the majority of it are Sunni.
Yes.
And so you have Sunni, Alawite, Christians, Druze, Kurds, and they're all fighting together as brothers in arms. I was sitting in one bunker with a colonel, and one of the guys there had survived the attack on Malula when they detonated a suicide bomber at the checkpoint, and 8 men died, and most of those were Muslim, and they're defending this Christian enclave. There was a great story of a Christian soldier who had to go into a mosque to fight, and he took off his boots to go into the mosque to wage battle, and he was killed in that battle, and there was such an outpouring of honor for that act of respect that he had done. This is not a Muslim versus other people fight. It's not a Sunni versus Shiite fight. The moderate rebels are 100% kind of extremist, fundamentalist, Wahhabi-based Sunnis. But the majority of Sunnis in Syria support President Assad and the Syrian way of life. And it's important for people to grasp these nuances.
Yes, a couple of years ago I found out when they held the elections in 2014, at one point there was a rally of women, Sunni Muslim women, 10,000 of them packed a mosque to pray for victory in the election for President Bashar al-Assad.
I didn't know that.
10,000 Sunni women.
Yeah.
And so, you know, he got 79% of the vote. You can't get 79% of the vote unless there are Sunnis.
Right.
And I spoke to people who voted in the lines in Lebanon. And there was one woman I remember who just stands out vividly, and she said, we stood in the hot sun, blazing sun, for 15 hours to vote. And the ambassador, the Syrian ambassador to Lebanon, told me, he said, we didn't know what to do. We never imagined there'd be so many people. I mean, people just lined up, and they came to vote. And this woman said, when we got to the front, we nicked our finger and we signed in blood to emphasize how serious we were about our support for President Assad's reelection. And so I'm just always amazed when we refer to him as a dictator when he was popularly elected in an election as fair as you can have in the course of a war. And our State Department, you know, which is always talking about democracy, John Kerry flew to Beirut and got off the plane just long enough to say, this election was a great big nothing. And then he got back on the plane and flew off. And people had, you know, in many cases risked their lives to vote. In many cases, they had stood the sun for 15 hours.
150 people died in Syria from snipers and mortars from rebels.
During the vote.
During the vote.
Yeah.
Our freedom and democracy rebels were killing them.
And there were 3 people on the ballot. The other people running were very, very prominent Syrian citizens. If the rebels had wanted, they could have said, we'll show this Assad. We'll vote for Mr. A or Mr. B. We'll throw our weight behind him. Well, they don't have any weight. They don't have it. And people don't realize that a huge portion of the rebels today, I would say it's probably 3/4, are not Syrians at all.
Right. Sure.
Many of them are Turks.
Right.
The biggest number of ISIS people come out of Tunisia.
In Saudi.
Saudi Arabia. Tunisia and Saudi Arabia are 1 and 2.
90%, I think, of the suicide bombers are Saudi.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think we could probably go on for hours and it would be invaluable, but I think this is probably a good point to stop, and we can certainly resume on another occasion, but I think that this is a real eye-opener, and I hope that people actually hear what you both have to say, see the pictures that will be part of this broadcast, and really have a Damascus Road.
Thank you so much.
Yes,
Thank
absolutely.
both of
Thank you very much
Jan,
for doing
Senator.
this.
We in Syria feel that what is needed is a real will in the international community to fight terrorism and to build real bridges. When I say real bridges, I mean on equal basis, on a matter of parity. We have to deal with each other on equal basis, on equal human basis, and dealing otherwise as superior and inferior, as white and black, as important and less important, is producing extremism, is producing racism, which is striking, not only in Syria, but in Brussels, in Paris, in Orlando, and last of all, in UK. Thus, it's in the interest of humanity to think as human beings, to think of the world as truly a human village, where people live equally and have mutual respect for each other and deal on the basis of parity. But this requires a huge change in the mindset of the West. We have an obligation to our grandchildren, wherever they are born, to leave them a better world than this one in which we live now. Thank you very much.